You can't accuse the people asked to look into how our banking system should be changed of shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted. Oh, no, no, no. There just need to be more safeguards, they say. Will it be the bankers carrying the can in future, or will it be the worker ants down below?
An internal split within banking already exists in America, but it didn't stop the crisis there, so why would it save us?
We hear from bankers' friends and foes, as well as the Lib Dem Treasury spokesman sacked from his job. Protests in Paris against a ban on the veil call it zealous secularism or religious bigotry. But should British Muslims be next?
Britain need to ban the burqa immediately. Immediately. It is the high time. It is high time. Otherwise, it's like a disease.
The author of The End of Faith, Sam Harris, will be debating with Muslims on both sides of the argument. Also tonight, Gaddafi go away, the Libyan rebels chant in English for international consumption. But do they know what they want to replace him with? Mark Urban is in Benghazi.
As the search for a diplomatic solution to the Libyan conflict intensifies, I've been finding out who's in charge here and whether they're just a revolutionary committee issuing well-meaning declarations or a real government in waiting.
Well, the banks seem to feel they got off pretty lightly. The team asked to look into what should be done with our banking system hasn't suggested they be broken up into separate retail and so-called investment businesses. It'd like a bit more competition, a bit more money held in reserve, so next time they get into trouble, either of their own making or not, the taxpayer doesn't get nailed quite so fast. And none of this is binding on the government anyway. First tonight, let's hear from our economics editor, Paul Mason.
We know all too well what panic looks like. In September 2008, global banks collapsed in seconds. The ATMs were just hours away from closure, and the world economy already sliding into the deepest recession since the 1930s. This was the headquarters of Lehman Brothers, the very epicenter of the panic 2.5 years ago. And what we needed was a coherent and decisive proposal to make sure that what happened there could never happen again. So did we get it? These are the people tasked with making sure the panic never happens again. A prof, 2 bankers, a gas regulator and an eminent financial scribe.
Taxpayers should not be on the hook for the banks. So reform is needed to make banks better able to withstand losses and easier and less costly to sort out if, unfortunately, they still get into difficulties.
The Commission's key proposal is to force all UK banks to set aside 10% of their capital to cover future losses. The current average is 4%, the international proposal 7%. On top of that, big investors who lend banks money should be liable to lose some of it. And on top of that, the high street bit of any bank should be internally ring-fenced from its investment arm. So, with any bank lending to British customers, the segment that only deals with the high street would be insulated from the risks incurred by the bigger bank, and the flow of capital between them would shrink. The problem is, this ring-fence rule already exists in America and has done for decades, and it didn't stop crisis there. That led to charges this morning that the Commission had, in the parlance, bottled it.
I absolutely reject any notion that we've bottled it. Reforms on these lines, and I stress it's an interim report, but reforms on these lines would be very, very far-reaching. We did not say 10%, we said at least 10%. We also said together with genuinely loss-absorbing debt. Now, if debt cannot be made genuinely loss-absorbing, then our at least 10% would be at least some higher number. The retail ring-fencing idea, now the precise form of that is for discussion and debate.
What the Banking Commission has done, effectively, is face the finance industry with a choice. They've said, do you want to hold a lot more capital, which will hit your profits in one way, or do you want to face almost total separation between retail and investment banking, which hits your profits in another? And because they know they want neither, what they're hoping is that they'll accept a bit of both. But in London's financial centre, they are not minded to accept it. This man, one of Britain's top financial lawyers, thinks making the banks hold more capital will ultimately penalise their customers.
Well, if we separate out the retail banks, as this report suggests, they can't hedge some of their risks, and it's going to cost them more to run their business. They can do one of three things. One of them is that they can increase the costs of lending to the real economy as a whole. One of them is that they can increase charges to their customers, which is going to be immensely unpopular. And the third is that they're going to increase the risk they're taking with their investments in order to generate the returns that they need.
The report says the UK's big universal banks like HSBC and Barclays pose risks to the whole economy and are big enough to sink the public finances. But those wanting a total breakup think today should have gone a lot further.
The idea that it will damage UK's economic prosperity to tightly regulate banks so that they are safe and that they do useful things is completely wrong. Banks are in fact a threat to the economy. This is what the report has recognised. And so if we don't do something that constrains them, that almost makes them less profitable, then have we really made them safe? Have we really, got them out of the way of the real economy? Have we made them useful again?
On the issue of competition, the report can lay claim to radicalism. It said Lloyds should be broken up and several new banks created on the high street. In diplomatic language, it said customers who think the banks are ripping them off probably have a point. But here again, consumer advocates want more.
We're still not going to have good competition in local banking. We're not going to have banks that can focus on small businesses and local areas, as they do in our competitor countries, such as in Germany. This is boiling down to saying, well, instead of 5 large banks chasing the same consumers with the same products, let's have 8 or 9 banks.
The politics of this will now get interesting, because as long as you've got a committee beavering away, taking evidence, you can paper over the rather large differences within the coalition on banking reform, and the fact that Labour doesn't really have a concrete alternative. But not anymore. Despite the headlines, in the city, they're quite sanguine.
This is a set of suggestions, some of them advanced rather tentatively, which, when you look at them together, we're saying, well, how about this, chaps? One possibility is that by the time this discussion has been concluded in a few months' time, even these suggestions may be considered to be too expensive for the benefits that they deliver. So one possibility is that nothing will happen at all.
After a panic like the last one, there's only one big chance to change the way the banking system works. Today, we've seen a map of the concepts, but the precise numbers remain algebraic.
Well, how nice it would be if one of these days we could hear a bank explain itself for itself. They spend so much on advertising and have had so much from the taxpayer, but they're so terribly, terribly shy. These were a few responses to our invitations today. Northern Rock didn't mince their words, definitely not. They said RBS said they wanted to see the report first. After they had seen it, they declined to appear. HSBC were not interested in taking part. Barclays said no, but that they'd call us back if that position changed. It didn't. Lloyds initially said it would be unlikely that they would take part, and then they called back to confirm just how unlikely. Santander said their CEO was away and wasn't doing interviews, as she only took up her post in December. We also invited the government to take part, but they, like the banks, declined. However, we have got some brave souls here. The economist Owen Stelzer, the former Lib Dem Treasury spokesman Lord Oakeshott, Gillian Tett, the US managing editor of the Financial Times, joins us from New York, and the Labour MP John Mann, who sits on the Treasury Select Committee, is in Lincoln for us. Now, Lord Oakeshott, is this going to prevent another calamity?
Yes, I think it is. It's a very thorough and excellent piece of report, piece of work, as you'd expect from John Vickers and his colleagues. I personally would have probably preferred a total breakup, but you don't set up an expert commission like this, and I think they make a very good case why, with the right safeguards, ring-fencing the retail banks can make it safe.
John Mann, is it going to make us safe?
No, it's not. It's a tiny little step in the right direction, but it does nothing to deal with the fundamental problems. It'll be banking as usual, and the bankers are laughing all the way home tonight.
Owen Stelzer, how does it seem to you?
It's a terrific report by a terrific economist. It persuaded me that we don't need structural changes, but that the safeguards he's building in will probably, I wouldn't say definitely, but will certainly reduce the probability of another calamity.
Now, Gillian Tett, how does it look from New York?
Well, it looks like a step in the right direction, quite a good step in the right direction, but will it guarantee against another calamity? No, because at the end of the day, banking is an international business. This is a national report, and in many ways, the remits of this report were quite limited.
Now, what about, first off, this point about the bank should be required to hold more capital so they've got a much bigger sort of buffer, I suppose. Right. Is that going to work?
Yes. There's no reason why that shouldn't work. And the notion that that's costly is crazy, because it's a lot more costly if they don't have a buffer.
Sure. Who pays for it, though?
Well, who paid for the last calamity? The taxpayer.
Sure,
in this case, the investor in the bank will pay for it, which is a lot better.
The consumer will pay.
The consumer will pay a lot less than he paid for the last calamity.
John Mann, how does it look to you?
It's helpful, but it needs to be much bigger. Much bigger. 10% is not going nearly far enough, and it means the risk remains there, and the consumer and taxpayer will lose out either way if another bank goes bust.
It does depend how we regulate the retail parts of the banks. I mean, I think of it rather like a water company. I mean, they have a regulated part which is very tightly controlled, because frankly, if the water is turned off from the basic British banking, we are all finished. And if that is properly controlled, it can work. I mean, the banks are moaning. They're saying it will cost more. Well, frankly, that's like a car manufacturer saying it costs too much to have proper brakes on their cars.
Gillian Tett.
I mean, the big elephant in the room that no one's talking about is that if you have a good system in place to deal with banks when they fail or when they run into problems, you don't necessarily need to have such sky-high levels of capital. Personally, I think it's good to have a 10% capital level they're talking about. But, I mean, you can look to a country like America, say the so-called FDIC, which has a system in place for making small and medium-sized banks collapse safely, if you like. And the reality is that during the financial crisis, a lot of American banks have failed, small to medium-sized, and that hasn't caused a crisis because there actually is a so-called resolution regime in place. And unfortunately, that's not something which is in the powers of this report to actually provide.
But it's also because such big banks.
Sure, Owen Stelzer shaking his head.
Gillian is right up to a point, but the fact is it did nothing for the banks that were too big to fail. We have a nice mechanism for small and medium-sized banks, how to take them over, make sure nobody loses, depositors don't lose money. But we got stuck in the same situation you guys got stuck in, which was that the guys that were too big to fail we had to spend taxpayers' money to save their lives.
What about this point that there will be more competition in the banking sector, and that somehow will be good for us? I mean, John Mann, do you find that plausible?
We need far more competition, but not 2 or 3 more banks. You know, it's not that long ago we had 30 building societies that have all disappeared. Yeah. We need to have 30, 40 banks competing and building societies across the country if you want to have healthy competition.
Gillian Tett, you're nodding. You agree, do you?
I strongly agree. I think more diversity in finance is absolutely crucial to build a stronger system, and that's true in finance as in most other parts of modern life. And unfortunately, it has been that lack of diversity which has been so deadly.
But we've really got to crack on, first of all, with getting Lloyds cut down to size. I mean, Gordon Brown...
Well, they're being Lloyds, the bank, are being told to sell several hundred branches.
Yeah, but we need to go a lot further than that. I mean, the Commission makes the point that Lloyds has 1/3 of the current accounts in the country. Lloyds and RBS between them have 1/2. Now, that is far too concentrated, and I'd like to see the Commission, when it does its final report, getting much tougher with Lloyds and much more specific about how much we need to sell off, because you cannot have a competitive banking market with anything like this concentration.
You're making some huge assumptions here. We are assuming that this wonderful coalition government that you so roundly support will have the guts to act on any of this?
Well, I totally support the coalition agreement, and the reason I jumped before I was pushed as a Treasury spokesman is because Project Merlin, that the banks got away with murder. They ran rings around the Treasury, rings around the government. Well, they talked a good game, but it didn't happen, and the bonuses are still flowing. Now, on this one,
I suggest to you there's damn all chance.
Well, there is a very good chance. This is actually a very carefully constructed report. John Vickers and his colleagues have got very interesting proposals which will smoke out the banks. The banks will have to defend themselves, and then I believe the final version will be something we can all support. And I can assure you, the Liberal Democrats, we believe we should reorganise the banks, not the National Health Service. That's what the country needs, and we will make sure it happens. So
you believe George Osborne will sign up to this?
I don't think he's going to have a big choice.
Right.
This is a very well-reasoned document that he's ordered out. So he's in the position of either going along with it or saying, I won't buy it.
Pretty mild by comparison with what it might have said.
It depends what you mean by might have been. It might have broken a whole lot of crockery, but it didn't do that.
You can't have it both ways.
Think about one thing about the
You can't say it's not extreme enough, but it won't be done. I mean, the point is this is a sensible
compromise. I'm a journalist, I can have it every
which
way.
is going to happen.
Come on.
Well, no, this is going to happen. Osborne and Cameron will have nowhere to hide when this comes out.
Gillian, I would like to ask you, I know you're desperate to get in, I'd like to ask you one particular perspective that you've got. We keep on hearing that banks are going to think about decamping from this country if they're made to behave slightly differently. Do you get any whiff of that in New York?
Well, there's 2 points to make. Firstly, that actually, if you look at the scorecard of the relative attractiveness of London versus New York at the moment, it's actually a pretty mixed picture. On some counts, London wins. On other counts, New York wins. So I don't think you're necessarily going to see a lot of people shifting between London and New York right now, maybe in the future. Of course, there are Asian centres which are starting to look a lot more attractive for bankers because there is less control and there's more politically welcoming climate. But there's 2 points to make. One is that you're already seeing a lot of big investment banks, global banks, moving operations out of London quietly without anyone noticing. That's likely to continue. But secondly, even if big banks do move their headquarters out of London, London as a financial centre, as a trading centre, can still remain very vibrant. You don't necessarily need to have British banks headquartered in London to actually ensure the City of London survives.
John Mann, do you worry about banks decamping?
Not particularly, because we're far too reliant over the last 20 years in our economy on the financial sector, and we need to be diversifying into other sectors. Britain relying on banking.
You've got to have something to diversify into, haven't you?
Well, but what we need to do is be recreating some of the old building societies as new building societies, getting some new banks in and having a proper thriving competitive sector, and not just relying on the same old 4 super banks that we've got.
Gillian Tett.
I was going to say one other thing, which is it's not necessarily clear that other governments necessarily want the headquarters of British banks on their own shore, because they don't want their taxpayers to be on the hook for big banks that may fail either. I mean, you know, the idea that the regulators in New York are dying to have, say, Barclays or any other bank pitch up here simply is not true. And I think that's probably true of Asia as well. So the picture is much more subtle than it might seem. People can move even if the headquarters isn't actually shifting itself.
OK, thank you all very much indeed. Thank you. Well, now, the leader of the Liberal Democrats on Liverpool City Council has urged the Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg, to pull out of coalition government in a confidential email seen by the BBC. Warren Bradley said that Liberal Democrat councillors were set to lose lots of seats in May's local elections, and the coalition was to blame. Michael Crick is here. What was in the email?
Well, Warren Bradley, you've got to remember, is one of the most senior Liberal Democrats in local government. He was leader of the council for 5 years, up until last May. He says in pretty vivid language, "I don't want to be in bed with the Tories. Unfortunately, the boil is about to come to a head and burst, probably on election night." Some more quotes. "Long-serving councillors could be defeated not because of their record, but because of your record," he says to Mr Clegg and the Lib Dem MPs, "and the perception of what we as Liberal Democrats now are. We have to be independent and we have to sever ties from the coalition. If we fail to do this..."
We have to what?
we have to sever ties from the coalition. If we fail to do this, we have only our parliamentarians to blame. Now, Mr Bradley has never really been a very fan of the coalition. I mean, last summer he was saying that only a few weeks after it was formed that the Liberal Democrats could be wiped out in local government in the north of England because of their alliance with the coalition. Nonetheless, I think his views do reflect the nervousness of Liberal Democrat councillors, more than 2,000 of whom are up for election this May, and many hundreds of whom are likely to lose.
Apart from the fact he can't spell annals, for example, the annals of history, nulls of history, there was something else you wanted to tell us, and I've completely forgotten what it was.
Well, a bit about Norman Lamb and his remarks about the health bill being very risky and suggesting he might resign if the pace of reforms wasn't slowed. I think what we're seeing here is certain Liberal Democrats distancing themselves from the Conservative side of the coalition as they get rather nervous about May. We'll probably see a lot more of it in Scotland and Wales in particular. We even saw a little bit of it just now, I think, with Lord Oakeshott and his remarks about how he'd prefer reorganisation of the banks to reorganisation of the health service.
Michael, thanks very much. Well,